All right, let's talk about something that gets brushed aside far too often in the sprawling madness of Warhammer 40,000, the Siege of Cthonia. Yeah, that's right, Cthonia, the homeworld of Horus himself, a planet that should have been a galactic monument etched into the collective memory of the Imperium. But instead, it's like a ghost, a story nobody tells, a battle nobody sings about. And that, in a universe obsessed with myth and martyrdom, should make every Warhammer fan stop and wonder what really happened there. Because this wasn't just another strategic engagement during the Horus heresy. This wasn't some nameless Forge world caught in the crossfire. This was Cthonia, the pit-born cradle of the Luna Wolves, the breeding ground of gang-scarred warriors who became the deadliest of the Emperor's chosen. And yet, while Isstvan, Prospero, and Terra are turned into entire franchises of lore, the battle for Cthonia is left to rot in the margins, lost beneath the layers of ash, propaganda, and silence. So why is that? Was the siege of Cthonia too brutal, too shameful, too politically inconvenient to remember? Or, worse, was it forgotten on purpose? Could the Imperium have buried it for what it revealed, or for what it failed to achieve? There's a strange finality to how it's spoken of, if at all, as if Cthonia didn't just fall, but was deliberately erased. But you and I both know Warhammer doesn't let anything go that easily. Every ruin has echoes. Every battlefield has ghosts. And Cthonia is screaming. So this is where we dig. Through the dirt, the bone, the collapsed catacombs, and the fractured memories. We're going to talk about why the Siege of Cthonia matters, why it still matters, and what it really says about the legacy of Horus, the loyalty of his sons, and whether or not the homeworld of the War Master was truly lost forever, or just waiting for someone to remember. If you want to understand why the Siege of Cthonia cuts deeper than just another battle in the archives of the Horus heresy, you first need to understand what Cthonia was. Not just where it was on the star maps, though that's part of it, but what it meant. What kind of place could possibly shape a figure like Horus Lupercal, the most beloved and most reviled of all the Primarchs? What kind of hell had to exist to forge the Luna Wolves into the Emperor's most feared attack dogs? Cthonia was a planet hollowed out from the inside, and I don't just mean emotionally, though yeah, that too. I mean physically. Its crust was riddled with mines, shafts, tunnels, entire underhive cities stacked on top of each other like corpses in a crypt. There was barely any surface left to live on. What you got instead was a world where people were born, lived, and died underground, generations upon generations who never even saw the sky. The only light they knew came from flickering arc lamps or the muzzle flashes of a rival gang. The walls weren't just stone, they were rusted steel and old blood. Cthonia breathed desperation. Culturally, it was pure violence, but not chaos. Never mistake Chthonian culture for random savagery. It had rules, it had rhythm, it had ritual. Gangs weren't just survival tools, they were families, hierarchies, governments, all rolled into one. If you were Chthonian, your life was measured in kills and scars. You either bled or made someone else bleed. And from this labyrinth of brutality came some of the fiercest warriors humanity ever spat into the void. They didn't fight for honor, they fought because fighting was the only thing that meant anything. And in that furnace of constant conflict, something terrifyingly effective was born. The planet's proximity to Terra was another layer of irony. Cthonia wasn't some forgotten rim world, it was close, practically on the Emperor's doorstep. Yet while Terra built monuments and temples, Cthonia dug deeper into its own rot. Some fans believe that was intentional, that the Emperor let the planet rot, using it as a crucible for creating killers he could later convert into his angels of death. Others argue he simply didn't care until the Primarchs were found. But when Horus was finally reunited with his gene father, Chthonia's blood-soaked legacy didn't get wiped away. It got amplified. And here's the part that really sticks with me. Cthonia didn't corrupt Horus, it made him. The planet didn't break the Primarch, it refined him into something sharp, something strategic. Horus didn't just learn to fight in the tunnels of Cthonia. He learned how to rule there. He understood hierarchy, loyalty, fear, and ambition because he lived it before he even met the Emperor. And that made him different. Even among the other Primarchs, there was always something grounded about Horus. He wasn't lofty like Guilliman or haunted like Curza. He was real. He was human, at least at first. That realism came straight from Cthonia. Its dirt was in his blood. Its traditions, blood oaths, scars as rank, silent loyalty to your gang over the world. They didn't vanish when the Luna Wolves became the Sons of Horus. They just got rebranded. A lot of people forget that. They think the change in name wiped away the past. But the truth is, the Luna Wolves never stopped being Chthonian. They just went galactic. And maybe that's why the planet was always doomed to be buried. First metaphorically, then literally. Because Cthonia wasn't a symbol of glory. It was a symbol of reality, of brutality, of what it really meant to take humanity and reforge it into a weapon. It stood too close to the truth. And when you build a myth like the Imperium, the truth is dangerous. You don't want to talk about the corpse-filled tunnels where loyalty meant slitting a friend's throat before he slit yours. You want to talk about honor, about light, about sacrifice. But for those who remember, Cthonia was sacrifice. It was blood for blood, fire for fire, and it never stopped burning. That's why I think its story was silenced. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Because in the bones of that dying world, you can still feel the heartbeat of the First Legion's soul. And that soul was never clean. It was scarred, violent, and utterly unforgettable. Even if history pretends otherwise. Before Horus, before the Luna Wolves, before the banners of the Imperium ever fluttered through its tunnels, Cthonia was already alive. Not in the romanticized sense of a world brimming with nature or culture, but in the way a knife gleams in the dark right before it strikes. It was a world in motion, a place pulsing with conflict, grit, and a kind of primal logic that outsiders could never truly grasp. To most people in the galaxy, a planet like Cthonia would be labeled a lost cause, a decaying, toxic husk riddled with violence. But to the people who lived there, it was home. A hard home, sure, but still theirs. And before the arrival of Horus, that world had its own grim order. It all started with the mines, those deep, choking arteries that cut through the planet like infected veins. The Imperium, or what little remained of old Earth's influence during the Age of Strife, had long since forgotten any pretense of governance here. The mining guilds that once claimed to hold authority had crumbled into irrelevance. In their place rose something more brutal, more adaptive. Gangs. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Each one claiming turf, defending shafts, controlling routes and choke points like feudal lords in a hellscape of concrete and blood. These gangs weren't your cartoonish criminals or theatrical warlords. They were survivalists, tacticians, sociopaths raised by violence and hardened by necessity. Children grew up with knives in their hands and scars on their faces. You learned to fight not in some ritual arena, but in the corridors leading to your ration block, or when another family decided they liked your water recycler better than theirs. It wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. That was the only real currency. And if you couldn't survive, no one remembered your name. Not even your own crew. There's a whole theory some fans throw around that the culture of the Luna Wolves wasn't created by Horus. It was inherited. And honestly, I believe it. The precision of the chain of command, the silent communication, the way they turned butchery into choreography, that didn't come from military training manuals, that came from decades, maybe centuries of generational war in those tunnels. Chthonian gangs fought in formations. They had codes. They marked their flesh with loyalty brands and memory scars. There was honor among them, twisted as it was. Not out of goodness, but because when everything else collapses, ritual is the only thing that holds people together. One of the things that always strikes me when I read the few accounts that survived from this era is how much respect Chthonians had for strength, not just brute force, but cunning, timing, the kind of strategic violence that left your enemy bleeding before they even saw the knife. Leaders weren't chosen by vote. They took power with a single clean kill. And if someone took them down later, well, so be it. That was the game. No grudges, just the chain resetting. There were clans that ran entire sectors of the underworld, old dynasties with names whispered like curses. But no matter how powerful a gang got, it never stopped being vulnerable. There was always someone watching, always someone hungrier, meaner, or smarter. That's how they kept the ecosystem going. And it wasn't chaos. It was its own twisted form of balance. If you climbed too high, you painted a target on your back. And if you got too comfortable, the tunnels reminded you why you had to keep moving. And here's something that gets overlooked in a lot of Imperial records: the faith. Or rather, the belief systems these gangs held onto. They didn't worship gods in the traditional sense, but they did believe in things: bloodlines, vendettas, symbols carved into bone. They believed in spirits that haunted the lower shafts, in cursed veins of ore, in the idea that dying with your gang's sigil still hot in your flesh meant something in the void. They had rites for the dead. They had war songs. It wasn't pretty, but it was real, and it gave meaning to a life that otherwise had none. When you think about that kind of existence, it's no wonder Horus fit into it like a hand in a glove when he was finally discovered. He didn't have to invent order. He just had to refine it. The people of Cthonia didn't need taming. They needed direction. And even before his rise, you can feel the planet brewing for something. Like all that violence was waiting for a purpose. Like the mines themselves were holding their breath. Some even argue, and I admit this theory gives me chills, that the warp didn't scatter Horus by accident. That it chose Cthonia for him because it knew that only on this dying, burning, half-forgotten world would he find the perfect storm of loyalty, strength, and rage he'd need to become the War Master. Because the Chthonians were already warriors. All Horus had to do was give them a new battlefield. And when you see it that way, the Cthonia of old becomes more than just a grim origin story. It becomes the forge where the fate of the Imperium was first hammered into shape. Not with gold or glory, but with grit, fire, and the unyielding will to outlive everyone else. Even your brothers. When Horus was finally found on Cthonia, the planet didn't erupt into celebration. There were no parades, no weeping crowds, no golden banners raised to the stars. What happened was quieter and much more dangerous. Because the moment Horus set foot among the gangs of his birth world, something shifted. Not instantly, not like some divine switch being flipped, but slowly, like tectonic plates grinding into alignment. The chaos didn't vanish. It focused. That's what made Horus different from so many of his brothers. He didn't try to erase Chthonia's savagery. He embraced it. Not because he liked violence, but because he understood it. He knew that these weren't wild beasts to be tamed. They were loyal, brutal creatures who only respected power and only followed those who bled with them. So Horus bled. Not metaphorically. He fought the gang lords, beat them in their own rituals, took scars, gave worse. And in doing so, he didn't just gain command, he earned something far rarer: respect. A lot of people picture Primarchs as gods descending from the stars. Horus wasn't that. He wasn't aloof. He didn't speak in riddles or walk above the dirt. He got in the grime with the worst of them. And that's exactly why they followed him. The gangs didn't become less violent under his rule. They became organized. Old feuds were resolved with efficiency, not endless bloodletting. Turf wars turned into training grounds. Initiations became trials for real war. Horus didn't civilize Cthonia. He weaponized it. The early recruits of what would become the Luna Wolves weren't noble knights or planetary defenders. They were killers, thieves, muscle for hire. But when you look at them through the lens of what Horus saw, they were also loyal, disciplined, and ruthless. the perfect foundation for a legion that would punch through the galaxy like a bullet. And he didn't recruit them by promising glory. He gave them something far more real: purpose. For the first time, their violence had meaning beyond survival. It was now service, and that hit deeper than any propaganda ever could. What's often overlooked is how Horus imported not just people, but culture. The Luna Wolves' early ranks weren't just filled with Chthonian-born, they were soaked in Chthonian values. Territory became formation structure. Gang markings evolved into company heraldry. Even the way they moved in battle, fluid, fast, brutal, mirrored how Chthonian gangs fought in the shafts. Close quarters, no wasted motion, all instinct and momentum. You see that, and it's impossible not to feel the fingerprints of the mines all over the Legion. Some fans like to draw comparisons between Horus and Guilliman, saying one ruled through charisma, the other through law. But honestly, I think that's too simple. Horus had charisma, yeah, but it wasn't the messianic kind. It was more like gravity. People fell into his orbit, and once you were caught, you didn't want to leave. Not because he demanded it, but because he made you believe that you mattered. That you were part of something vast and inevitable. That the scars you carried weren't shameful, they were proof you belonged. The loyalty he commanded wasn't just military, it was familial. The word brother meant something visceral to those early Luna Wolves. It wasn't a title, it was a bond sealed in blood and darkness. They would kill for Horus, die for him. Not because of gene seed, but because he got them. He remembered the tunnels, the rites, the smell of ozone and rust, and in return, they gave him everything. It wasn't blind devotion, it was earned. That's what makes the later betrayal all the more gutting, but we'll get there in time. There are accounts, fragmentary ones, that talk about how Horus would sometimes walk the older tunnels alone, even after he'd been crowned War Master. No guards, no ceremony, just a man retracing the scars of his past. Maybe it was sentiment, maybe it was strategy. But to me, it speaks volumes. Because no matter how many systems he conquered, he never turned his back on Cthonia. Not really. It was always with him. Under his skin, in his tone, in the way he shaped his sons. Some say that the Chthonian gangs were erased when the Great Crusade began, that they were folded into the Imperium, polished up, cleaned for duty. But that's a lie we tell to make ourselves feel better. The truth is, those gangs became the Imperium's edge. Horus didn't destroy them. He just gave them uniforms and told them which stars to bleed under. And I think that's part of why the siege of Cthonia feels so cursed. Because it wasn't just about territory, it was about memory. The world that gave birth to the War Master didn't die with him. It was carried into battle by every legionnaire who remembered the tunnels, who knew what it meant to fight not for glory, but for the brother beside you. Cthonia wasn't lost in one day. It was taken apart, piece by piece, each time that loyalty was used and then discarded. Each time someone forgot that under all the armor and doctrine, the heart of a legion still beat to the rhythm of the mines. When the Great Crusade truly began and Horus took his place beside the Emperor, something subtle but irreversible happened to Cthonia. It started to fade. Not physically, not all at once. The planet was still there, still spinning in the dark, still breathing in rust and smoke. But its soul was being pulled away, conscripted into the stars. Every ship that launched from Chthonian soil felt like it tore another chunk of the world's identity free. And those left behind? They were the ghosts of a home that was already slipping into myth. Cthonia wasn't abandoned deliberately. It just wasn't needed in the same way anymore. The Emperor had found his son, the Legion was growing, and the eyes of the Imperium turned outward. Horus, for all his fierce attachment to the culture of his home, was tasked with leading humanity's expansion. That meant conquests, not caretaking. So while he carried Cthonia in his blood, his focus was no longer the mines and gangs. It was the galaxy. And for the people still living in the deep tunnels, That shift was seismic. A lot of fans romanticize the early days of the Great Crusade as this golden time when the Primarchs were united, the legions were loyal, and the Emperor walked with his sons. But for Cthonia, it was more like a bleeding out. The planet had always been dangerous, but now it was emptying. The strongest, the smartest, the most brutal, the ones most likely to survive, were pulled into the Luna Wolves. Recruiters came constantly, skimming the cream off the top of every gang, every war band, every underhive crew. And not gently either. You didn't volunteer for glory. You were taken. If you were tough enough, you were pressed into service. If not, you stayed behind and watched your world lose its edge. What's left when you hollow out a hollow world? Not much. The remaining population skewed younger, older, weaker. The gangs still existed, but they were shadows of what they once were. The old hierarchies collapsed or were replaced by desperate improvisations. Some say that mini-wars broke out in the tunnels between those loyal to the Luna Wolves and those who felt abandoned. Others claim that cults started forming in the void left by Horus's departure, groups that venerated him not as a warrior, but as a god figure, a savior who had transcended the mines and would someday return. And here's the part that haunts me. No one really knows what Cthonia became during this period. There are barely any records, no detailed pict captures, no official logs from the Administratum. It's like the Imperium stopped caring, or maybe they deliberately chose not to remember. That absence of detail creates a space for theories, and the fandom has definitely filled it. Some say Cthonia turned inward, becoming a planet-sized shrine to Horus's early victories. Others think it fractured completely, descending into cannibalistic war and madness without the Luna Wolves to impose order. There's even one grim theory that the Adeptus Mechanicus began strip mining it in secret, salvaging the last usable ore and tech from a world already considered spent. What's undeniable is the psychological weight of this fading. For the Chthonian-born legionnaires out among the stars, home became more idea than place. When they thought of Cthonia, they weren't remembering its present. They were conjuring its past. The smoke, the scarred faces, the gang tags etched into ferrocrete walls. That memory stayed pure, untouched by whatever was happening down in the depths now. And maybe that was easier. Maybe it was better to believe that home was frozen in time, still waiting for them, than to acknowledge the truth, that it was dying while they fought in someone else's wars. There's a story, half myth really, about a group of legionnaires who returned to Cthonia during a rare respite in the Crusade. They expected to find something noble, something preserved. Instead, they found decay. Not the glorious decay of battle, but the sad, slow rot of neglect. The tunnels were still there, but the pride was gone. The gangs they'd grown up in were dust, their old names, their blood oaths, forgotten. And that hurt more than any battlefield wound. They'd given everything to the Emperor's cause, and their home didn't even recognize them anymore. That moment, if it really happened, says a lot. Because it marks the beginning of a shift. Cthonia as not just a literal place, but a symbol. A scar on the psyche of a legion that had already lost its grounding. And for Horus, that may have stung even more deeply. He was the War Master now, the one who brought unity and vision to the Crusade. But he couldn't preserve the one place that had made him. And maybe that knowledge, quiet, bitter, inescapable, started to eat at him in ways no one could see. Cthonia during the Great Crusade became a paradox. It was the root of the Luna Wolves' strength and the proof of their disconnect. It stood still while everything else moved forward. And in a galaxy obsessed with progress, that was the same as being left behind. The siege of Cthonia didn't begin with a declaration. It didn't start with war horns or proclamations echoing across Vox channels. It began in silence, like a knife slipping between ribs. A quiet order whispered across battle groups and blacked out reports. Because this wasn't just another military operation, it was a message. A reckoning. A purge masquerading as a campaign. And once you realize that, the whole thing feels heavier. Not just tragic, but deliberate. So who gave the order? Who actually initiated the attack? Officially, it was the Imperium. More specifically, the High Lords acting in the Emperor's name, though by that point, everything ran through layers of secrecy and justification. Some point to Rogel Dorn, others to Malkador the Sigillite, and some even whisper that it was Roboute Guilliman who pushed for it, citing strategic necessity. But here's the thing. They all had a reason. Cthonia was the homeworld of Horus, and by the time the siege began, that fact alone made it a target. The galaxy was bleeding. Horus had betrayed the Imperium, shattered brotherhoods, and turned half the legions against their creators. Every inch of territory that had once been sacred was now tainted by doubt. And what could possibly symbolize that corruption more clearly than the planet where he was forged? Cthonia wasn't just Horus's home. It was the womb of his legion. Every soldier that once fought beneath his banner had roots there, whether in blood or belief. If the Imperium wanted to sever that legacy, they couldn't just erase Horus. They had to erase where he came from. But there's a cruel irony here. Cthonia, at this point, wasn't launching fleets. It wasn't coordinating attacks. It wasn't a war machine. It was a husk, a shell filled with echoes and diehards, some loyal to Horus, some just trying to survive in the collapse. Attacking it wasn't about threat mitigation. It was about cleansing, about sending a message to the sons of Horus that there would be no home to return to, no sanctuaries, no past to retreat into, only ashes. And that's what makes the siege so chilling. It wasn't just aimed at destroying infrastructure, it was aimed at memory, at identity. The Imperium wanted to unmake Cthonia in the same way Horus had unmade his oath, with fire, with precision, with no turning back. There are whispers, unconfirmed, half-sourced, that the initial assault wasn't even launched by a full legion, but by specialist strike forces, kill teams, Loyalist operatives, even elements of the Imperial Fists sent in under shadow orders. The goal wasn't to storm the planet in a grand battle, it was to destabilize it from within. To light fires in the catacombs, turn gang against gang, and choke the world with its own paranoia before the real siege even began. But the resistance came, and it came hard. Because despite everything, Cthonia still had fighters. Not armies, not battalions, but war bands, survivors, old gang veterans too stubborn to die, too angry to kneel, and perhaps most importantly, remnants of the sons of Horus who hadn't followed their brothers to the siege of Terra. Loyalists to the War Master, or at least to the dream of what he had been. They weren't deluded. They knew Cthonia was a target, but they didn't run. For them, this was the last stand. Not just militarily, but spiritually. If they let Cthonia fall without a fight, then Horus was truly gone. That's what separates the siege of Cthonia from so many other war zones during the heresy. It wasn't about conquest, it was about judgment. Both sides were trying to prove something. The Imperium, that it could still cleanse rot with fire. The Defenders, that even in betrayal, there was still honor left in loyalty to your roots. Some called it madness, fighting for a dying world that had nothing to offer. But to those who stayed, it wasn't about resources. It was about remembrance. And let's not pretend this was a clean operation. The violence was brutal. The initial weeks saw block-by-block combat, gang ambushes in the dark, and tunnel collapses that buried entire platoons alive. Chthonia's labyrinthine understructure worked against the attackers. It was like trying to kill a world from the inside out, never knowing which shaft led to a dead end and which one was a trap. You can almost feel the desperation from both sides. For the Imperium, every inch gained felt like vengeance. For the Defenders, every inch held was a scream against erasure. And as the war dragged on, more voices joined the chaos. Legion remnants, scavenger fleets, even opportunistic rogue war bands drawn in by the scent of death and legend. The siege became more than a battle. It became a vortex, pulling in everything unresolved about Horus's fall and smashing it together beneath the rusting bones of the planet that made him. And that's the point, really. This wasn't just some aftershock of the heresy. It was part of its soul. The siege of Cthonia was the last gasp of a memory both sides couldn't bear to hold, but neither could let go. And the planet itself? It endured all of it. The bombs, the blood, the betrayal. Not because it was strong, but because it had always endured. That's what Cthonia did. It survived the digging. It survived the gangs. And now it would survive the siege, if only in legend. The fighting on Cthonia wasn't grand in the way people usually imagine heresy battles. There were no towering titans striding across open plains, no massed ranks of superhuman warriors charging in daylight. This war happened in the dark, in the dust, in the forgotten spaces between collapsed walls and flickering lights. It was fought one corridor at a time, one breath at a time, in tunnels that hadn't seen sunlight in millennia. And if you weren't born in those tunnels, you didn't stand a chance. It started small, as these things often do. Sabotaged oxygen pumps, ambushed patrols, rusted maintenance shafts, repurposed into deadly traps. The defenders knew every twist of the maze, every false panel, every echo that didn't belong. The Imperials brought firepower, structure, and strategy, but the locals brought something more terrifying: instinct. They didn't need orders. They operated on reflex, memory, and raw hate. And in a place like Cthonia, that was worth more than 1,000 tactical doctrines. What hit hardest for me while reading about this period was the sheer desperation. Neither side had enough supplies. Ammunition was hoarded like relics. Rations were practically a myth. They say some defenders survived on recycled nutrient paste and lichens scraped from old water pipes. Legionaries used to operating with near-infinite support were suddenly rationing bolter shells and using combat knives more than ever. The siege became feral, not just physically, but mentally. Soldiers didn't just lose brothers, they lost themselves. The tunnels didn't just house the war, they shaped it. Fighting in tight quarters broke down traditional formations. It was too cramped for heavy armor, too unpredictable for orbital scans to be reliable. Entire squads vanished in the dark, never seen again. Some got lost, others were swallowed by cave-ins, and some, well, there are stories of Chthonian partisans dragging Marines off one by one, disassembling them piece by piece, and leaving what was left hanging in forgotten junctions as warnings, not for fear, but for message. You do not belong here. One of the figures who really stands out during this chaos is Tyros Varen, a name almost never mentioned outside the deeper fan circles. He was a former Luna Wolf, left behind during the earliest waves of the Crusade, too injured to continue but too stubborn to die. When the siege began, he re-emerged, not as a commander, but as a symbol. He wasn't leading by rank, he was leading by presence. They say his armor was rusted to hell, pieced together from half a dozen sources, but his eyes never stopped burning. He knew the old ways, and to those still loyal to Horus, he was the old ways, not the war master of Terra, but the gang-born god of the catacombs, the brother who never forgot where he came from. But there were betrayals too. You can't talk about Cthonia without touching that raw nerve. Some of the defenders turned, switched sides, not out of ideology, but out of exhaustion. They wanted it to end. They saw their comrades torn apart, their homes turned to slag, and they made choices. Joined the Imperials, became guides, informants. To many, that was unforgivable, the ultimate sin. Worse than dying with a Loyalist symbol carved into your chest was helping them. In the tunnels, traitors weren't shot. They were erased. Whole crews vanished into walls for turning. And sometimes, entire sectors of tunnel collapsed, not by accident, but as vengeance. Even among the attackers, things got twisted. Imperial forces began fracturing under the pressure. Units became isolated. Communications failed. Some Astartes from rival legions began operating with their own agendas, seeking personal glory or revenge. And others, particularly those with older ties to Cthonia, started questioning what they were doing. There are rumors, half denied in the lore, of Luna wolves who had turned loyalist but froze when they saw what was being done to their home, who dropped their weapons mid-sweep and just walked away. Not to defect, just to stop participating. And through all this, the war dragged on. Not in great decisive battles, but in months and years of attrition. Every gain came at a cost. Every inch of progress triggered a new ambush, a new trap. There's a report that mentions an entire detachment of Imperial fists being lost when a tunnel system was flooded with corrosive waste from ancient mining reserves. Not even in battle, just drowned in forgotten bile that had sat underground for centuries. Cthonia itself became the executioner. What makes it all worse is that none of it was glorious. There were no parades, no songs. The heroes of the siege weren't raised in monuments. They were buried in them. There's a sense among some fans that the silence surrounding the siege afterward wasn't just about shame. It was about trauma. Those who fought there didn't want to remember, and those who didn't couldn't understand. The siege of Cthonia didn't play by the rules of traditional warfare. It broke them. It crushed the pride of both sides and replaced it with something rawer, something harder to categorize. And in the end, survival became the only victory that mattered. Not winning, just not dying, and even that was rare. That's what haunts me most, that under all the armor and orders and ideology, what happened in those catacombs was so human. The fear, the betrayal, the moments of blind courage and bitter silence. This wasn't a war fought for control. It was fought for memory, for identity, for the right to say, I was here and I didn't let them erase me. And in that, the defenders, those ragged, half-starved ghosts of Cthonia, might have won more than they ever knew. When people talk about the siege of Cthonia, there's often this temptation to draw a clean line. Loyalists on one side, traitors on the other, the black and white of imperial propaganda. But the reality, like everything about Cthonia, was more complicated, dirtier, sadder, and far more personal. Because the war that tore through those tunnels wasn't just a clash of ideologies. It was a civil war within a civil war. Brothers fighting brothers who had once shared the same scars, the same past, the same darkness. On the surface, the Imperial forces were straightforward. They came flying the banner of the Aquila, with orders to reclaim or destroy what remained of Horus's legacy. Many of them were drawn from the Imperial fists, which makes sense, considering their deep involvement in the defense of Terra and their bitter rivalry with the Sons of Horus. Dorn's sons were methodical, relentless, and absolutely convinced that what they were doing was righteous. They didn't come to Cthonia with hatred. They came with purpose, to extinguish a threat, to eliminate a symbol. And in their minds, that made them the white side of the board. But there were others among them too. Elements of the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, even detachments from lesser-known chapters that had personal stakes in the heresy. Some were driven by vengeance, entire squads who had lost comrades to Horus's betrayal and wanted blood repayment. Others came because they believed in duty. The idea that no stone should be left unturned, no stain left to fester. To them, Cthonia wasn't just a world, it was a wound, and they came to cauterize it. Still, even among the Loyalists, there were fractures. There's been talk in fan circles about the quiet dissent among some Imperial forces during the siege, commanders who questioned the necessity of raising a world that no longer posed a real threat. A few even refused to engage in the deeper tunnel operations, citing the high civilian casualty projections and the psychological toll it took on their men. These weren't traitors, but they weren't comfortable either. And in the eyes of the more hardline factions, that was already a kind of weakness. And then you had the defenders, the so-called traitors, the Sons of Horus, or at least what was left of them. But to call them unified would be a mistake. By the time the siege began, the Legion was shattered, fractured into cells, isolated companies, and war bands that didn't always agree on what they were fighting for anymore. Some still burned with loyalty to the War Master. Others followed their old captains out of habit, not conviction. And some, perhaps the most tragic, were just lost. They had nowhere else to go, and Cthonia was the last thing they understood. You can feel the rawness of that loyalty when you read about the defenders. It wasn't ideological. It wasn't chaos-tinged madness or delusions of grandeur. It was personal. These were warriors who had bled for Horus, who had watched him rise and fall, and who still saw something worth protecting in the shadows of their home. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to hold on, to memory, to identity, to the last place that hadn't turned its back on them. Among them were names we rarely hear about, captains too insignificant for the big histories, but legends in the catacombs. Like Kavun Dren, a former assault sergeant who rallied his entire warband around the old ventilation spires, turning the upper mines into a death maze, or Remluko, a tech marine who repurposed mining servitors into makeshift war machines, building horrors out of scrap and spite. These weren't heroes in the classic sense, but they were champions of something raw and real. And let's not forget the mortals, the remnants of Chthonia's civilian population, those too stubborn or too desperate to flee. Many joined the defense, not because they worshipped Horus, but because the Loyalists were still outsiders, intruders. The same way the gangs used to see rivals from other levels, these people saw the Imperials as invaders in their home. Their loyalty wasn't to a cause, it was to survival, to spite, to pride. And that made them dangerous in ways no strategist could predict. What makes this all even more complex is that there were sons of Horus who had turned loyalist, who had rejected Horus's path after Istvan, who had tried to reintegrate into the Imperium. Some of them ended up on Cthonia too, sent back, ironically, to fight the remnants of the Legion they once called brothers. That's where the black and white really crumbles. Because how do you look a man in the eye, a man who once called you kin, and kill him just because someone told you he didn't belong anymore? There are no clean hands in this story, no perfect symbols. The Loyalists brought fire and righteousness, but they also brought destruction. The sons of Horus brought legacy and loyalty, but they also brought corruption and blood. And somewhere in the middle were those who didn't know which side they were on anymore, who just kept fighting because stopping felt like death. That, to me, is the heart of the siege of Cthonia. Not good versus evil, but memory versus forgetting. Identity versus annihilation. The defenders weren't trying to win, they were trying not to vanish. And the attackers weren't trying to conquer, they were trying to erase. And somewhere in that brutal, claustrophobic stalemate, the last truth of Horus's legacy played itself out. Not on Terra, not in the eye of terror, but in the tunnels of a dying world that refused to be silent. If you came to Cthonia expecting titans, drop pods screaming from the sky, or city-flattening orbital barrages, you came to the wrong war. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a grind. A fight fought with fingers bleeding on rusted grips and teeth clenched against the stench of melted flesh. The siege of Cthonia wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about adaptation. About learning how to kill in a place that was never meant for survival to begin with. And that's what makes the technology of this war so fascinating. It wasn't cutting edge. It wasn't about pristine bolters and golden armor. It was improvised, recycled, reclaimed. Every weapon, every tool, every trap was a reflection of the world that forged it. It was like the planet itself had taught its sons how to fight here, and now, in its dying hours, it was teaching them how to bleed. You wouldn't see knights marching through Chthonian tunnels. They'd never fit. Even dreadnoughts, icons of space marine endurance, were liabilities here. Too bulky, too slow, too loud. Most were left behind or stripped down, cannibalized for parts. What you did see were stripped-down power packs, customized respirators, and armor painted black not for stealth, but because the soot never washed off anyway. Most of the combat happened in corridors narrower than a land speeder. You couldn't fight with mass. You had to fight with presence. The defenders, especially those with deep roots in the old gangs, turned warfare into something almost ritualistic. They knew how to build traps that weren't just deadly, but demoralizing. Pressure plate mines rigged to not explode on contact, but on release. Shatter bombs hidden inside fake supply caches. There's even one account, gruesome as it is, of tunnels lined with skin-stripped servitor shells, wired with explosives, detonated when squads passed through what they thought was a makeshift memorial. It wasn't just about killing. It was about sending a message. This is our world, not yours. Even the mining equipment became part of the arsenal. Old plasma cutters, meant for boring through subterranean bedrock, were jury-rigged into thermal breachers. Power drills the size of a man's torso were attached to servo harnesses and used like primitive siege weapons. There's footage, grainy, probably apocryphal, of a Chthonian partisan tearing through an entire squad of solar auxilia with a rigged-up tunneler, the kind of thing you'd see in an ore plant, now stained with blood instead of rock dust. On the Imperial side, the tech had to evolve fast. Standard bolters were often too large to maneuver effectively in the winding shafts. Flamers and melta-weapons became crucial, short-range, high-impact, terrifying in confined spaces. Some fire teams carried seismic scanners and auspex rigs, not to detect the enemy, but to map out which tunnels were still stable. That's how unstable things were. Every firefight risked a cave-in, and the deeper you went, the less likely anyone was coming to pull you out. And then there were the drones, not sleek Mechanicum-made scouts. No, these were ramshackle things cobbled together from mining survey bots and dead servitors. Clunky, loud, but just mobile enough to scout ahead and just cheap enough to lose. Some had flamers welded on. Others were simply packed with explosives and sent skittering into the dark, waiting to trip someone's last nerve. One report mentions bone dogs, mechanical quadrupeds built from leftover Vox casings and rebar, programmed to attack anything with a heat signature. But the most terrifying weapons weren't mechanical at all. They were environmental. Gas vents ruptured on purpose to flood sections with noxious fumes. Tunnel junctions collapsed strategically to herd entire enemy forces into kill zones. Some defending squads even poisoned the water filtration systems in sectors they knew they couldn't hold, just to make sure no one else could use them. And in the most desperate cases, they simply sealed themselves inside with the enemy, blocked exits with rubble, and fought to the death in absolute darkness. No reinforcements, no extraction. Just the promise that if you entered their world, you wouldn't leave. To me, that's what really defines the tech and tactics of this siege. Not ingenuity in the conventional sense, but desperation made sacred. Everything was a weapon. Every surface a potential trap. Every sound a threat. And when the defenders couldn't find a weapon, they became one. Their bodies, their breath, their bones, everything offered up to the war in service of the memory they were trying to protect. And yes, there's something poetic in that. The sons of Horus, born in these tunnels, forged from gang blood and cave dust, were fighting in a way that felt like coming full circle. No armor mark upgrades, no siege tanks or orbital superiority, just close combat in the dirt, like it had been in the very beginning. It wasn't just warfare, it was return. The siege wasn't a technological showcase, it was a cultural funeral. You get the sense, reading old field notes and whispered recollections, that the Loyalists were disturbed by what they found. Not just the resistance, but the style of it. They came expecting resistance. What they weren't ready for was how deeply personal that resistance was. It wasn't strategy, it was vengeance. And when war turns into that, no amount of tech gives you the edge. In a way, the weapons of Cthonia weren't designed to kill efficiently. They were designed to remind you that you didn't belong, that this world wasn't yours to purify, to liberate, to claim, that the people who once called it home would rather die buried in ash and steel than surrender it. That's not something a bolter can stop. That's something you either survive or you don't. And on Cthonia, a lot of them didn't. After the fires burned out and the last Vox signals from Cthonia crackled into static, all that was left was silence. No grand declaration of victory, no banners raised in triumph, just a scarred planet wheezing in the dark, half collapsed and soaked in blood. And from that silence, the question still lingers. What remains of Cthonia now? Not just the rock and steel, but the culture, the soul, the people. The truth is, very few survived. The siege wasn't designed to allow for survivors. It wasn't a war of conquest. It was extermination wrapped in military protocol. Most of the defenders died below the surface, entombed in the very tunnels that once raised them. Entire generations of partisans, old gang scions, last chance fighters. They vanished into the dark with no one to remember their names. But not everyone was lost. Some made it out. Somehow. Whether by luck, betrayal, or brutal resilience, there were escapees. Scattered to distant void stations, picked up by pirate fleets, hidden within the ranks of rogue legions. And they carried something with them. Memory. It's hard to say how many of them truly considered themselves Chthonian anymore. A lot of them were broken, physically and spiritually. Others shed their identity like a burned skin, trying to forget. But there were a few, and the records are fragmentary, passed from whisper to whisper, who preserved the old ways. Gangs reformed on forgotten moons, symbols from the Underhive carved into new steel armor. Some of these survivors became mercenaries, cult leaders, even warlords in their own right. But no matter how far they traveled, you could always tell when someone came from there. There was a look in their eyes, a rhythm in their speech, a weight that never left their shoulders. And then there are the relics. Not many, of course. Cthonia wasn't the kind of world that made beautiful things, but it made meaningful things. Rusted blades with family etchings, data slates holding gang lineages traced back to pre-Unity times. One particularly eerie piece, a fragment of power armor with a still-functioning Vox recorder, looping a war chant in Old Chthonian every 90 seconds. These artifacts don't circulate in open markets. They're not trophies. They're sacred to the people who find them. Shrines get built around them in some of the weirder corners of the galaxy. Entire war bands have been known to kill over a single dog tag believed to have come from a siege fighter. It's that deep. Some believe the Chthonian bloodline still survives, not just culturally, but genetically. That the sons of those first gang-born legionnaires walk the galaxy today, unaware of their roots, but still shaped by them. It's a romantic theory, and a little tragic. Because if true, those descendants carry a legacy that's been erased from the records. The Imperium doesn't teach about Cthonia anymore. It buries the story beneath silence. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's fear that remembering will reopen old wounds. Or maybe, on some level, the Imperium understands that Cthonia represents a kind of truth too raw to process. Loyalty without reward, sacrifice without salvation. There's also the question of how the planet itself is remembered today. Most official charts label it as dead, non-operational, uninhabitable. Some even say expunged. A lot of players and fans believe that's intentional, that it's not just a description, it's a command. Forget it, let it fade. But you can't kill a legend that easily. In the eye of terror, warbands still whisper the name with reverence. Among the Black Legion, it's almost a holy word. Not because they think they'll return to Cthonia, but because they know what it meant. Even some Loyalist chapters have records, hidden and unofficial, of the siege and its consequences. Bits of data stored away in forbidden vaults. There's a rumor that a fragment of a Chthonian ventilation spire was salvaged and kept deep beneath the phalanx, out of sight, out of mind. As a reminder, or maybe a warning. It's hard to say. The truth is buried beneath so much distortion, it's impossible to tell where fact ends and myth begins. Still, every now and then, someone stumbles across something. A scrap of armor with unfamiliar gang symbols. A blade etched in glyphs no Mechanicus scholar can decode. A story passed down from Void Father to Void Son about a world that burned not for power, but for pride. And that's the legacy that lingers, not in monuments or data slates, but in spirit. Cthonia didn't die in the siege. It was interred. Its bones are still down there beneath the rubble and radiation. And for those who remember, or refuse to forget, it's still alive in a way. Still bleeding, still burning, still theirs. And in the grim, dark future where memory is often the only weapon left, sometimes that's all you need. There's something deeply tragic about that. The way a culture can be gutted, erased, and still pulse quietly through history like a forgotten heartbeat. You don't have to see it to feel it. You just have to listen for it. And if you do, if you really listen, you can still hear Cthonia breathing. Was Cthonia truly destroyed forever? That's the question that lingers like smoke in the lungs of anyone who spent time digging through the ashes of the heresy. And honestly, the answer might depend less on fact and more on what you want to believe. Because when it comes to Cthonia, the line between myth and memory has always been razor thin. The official records are blunt. Cthonia was rendered uninhabitable. No strategic value, no remaining population, nothing worth salvaging. A dead world. End of story. But we know how the Imperium writes its histories. Bleached clean, sanitized, weaponized. What isn't convenient gets buried. What's inconvenient gets obliterated. So it's no surprise that a growing number of fans, and let's be real, probably some in-universe truth seekers too, refuse to take that at face value. One of the most persistent theories is that parts of Cthonia survived. Not the surface, it was never about the surface, but deep beneath, in those endless winding catacombs that no satellite could ever fully map. These were generations-old shafts, deeper than any hive city, riddled with collapsed tunnels, half-forgotten vaults, and sectors so old, even the gangs considered them cursed. Some believe that entire communities sealed themselves away before the final bombardments, cutting ties with the rest of the planet and waiting out the war like hibernating beasts. And what if they're still down there, breeding, adapting, remembering? You hear whispers, nothing concrete of course, about silent ships docking in dead zones, receiving unmarked crates of gene-modified ore, or strange symbols painted in old gang code on space hulks drifting far from known routes. Too coincidental to ignore, too strange to fully accept. Some even think that these survivors have started seeding their bloodlines into other populations, ensuring the Chthonian legacy lives on in the most primal way, through the gene. Then there are the more abstract theories. The ones that say Cthonia never needed to physically survive because it embedded itself in the warp. That all the violence, the death, the legacy of loyalty and betrayal, it created an echo strong enough to stain reality. A spiritual Cthonia, a myth space. Not a demon world in the classic sense, but something different, something personal. A place that appears in dreams. A name muttered by psychers with no memory of its meaning. Some members of the Black Legion even claim that their deepest visions, those born in the Eye of Terror, surrounded by madness, lead them not to Lupercal's throne, but to a rust-covered door beneath the ground, always locked, always pulsing. And then there's the theory that Cthonia never truly ended because its ideology didn't. That the siege wasn't a death, it was a transformation. The old ways, the gang codes, the rites of blood and rust, they weren't erased. They were scattered, fractured, spread across the Imperium like cultural spores. You see flashes of it in unlikely places. A penal regiment in the Segmentum Obscurus with fighting styles eerily similar to Chthonian pit duels. A chapter of Astartes with initiation rituals involving blood branding and tunnel hunts. Even some rogue traitor dynasties tracing their lineage back to deep void origins that match nothing on any map. Some go further and claim that a resurgence is coming. That somewhere in the shadows of the Imperium Nihilus, a new brotherhood is forming. Not loyalist, not traitor, but Chthonian. A resurgence of the Forgotten Sons. Hardened by exile, unburdened by loyalty, carrying the spirit of Cthonia like a toxin in their veins. They wouldn't fly banners. They wouldn't build empires. They'd move like ghosts through dead systems, taking what they need, raising what they hate, and leaving behind nothing but questions and sigils scratched into the walls. Maybe they're already out there. Maybe they're watching, waiting for the next empire to forget them again. And the thing is, I want that to be true, because Cthonia deserves more than to be remembered only through Horus's failure. It wasn't just the home of a traitor. It was the forge of an entire way of life, brutal, unromantic, but honest. There was something pure in that survival, that loyalty to one's own. And maybe, just maybe, that kind of truth can't ever be destroyed fully. Maybe it just needs time to crawl back up from the dark. There's even a fringe idea I've always loved, that one day, long after the galaxy has burned and reformed 100 times, someone will return to Cthonia. Not as a conqueror, but as a seeker. They'll descend into the ruins, into the mines long collapsed, and find something still breathing. A culture held together by grit, scars, and memory. A place that never forgot who it was, even as the rest of the galaxy tried to forget it. That kind of story doesn't end with an explosion. It ends with continuation. Because destruction isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's just erasure of the visible. The seed might be buried, but it still exists. And maybe one day, that seed cracks the rock and grows again, jagged, unforgiving, but unmistakably Chthonian. And if that happens, if even one tunnel still echoes with the steps of someone who remembers the old ways, then no, Cthonia wasn't destroyed. It just went underground, like it always has, like it always will. So, was Cthonia truly lost forever? Or did it just slip out of the kind of history the Imperium knows how to write? After all we've seen, after the tunnels soaked in blood, the brothers turned enemies, the ghosts still howling beneath collapsed ceilings, I don't think the answer is as simple as yes or no. Because Cthonia was never just a place. It was a mindset, a rhythm, a wound that knew how to fight back. You don't erase something like that with orbital strikes and memory bands. You just push it deeper. And if there's one thing Cthonia taught its children, it's how to live in the dark. Yes, the surface was scorched. Yes, the records were scrubbed, the people hunted, the culture buried beneath the weight of loyalty and betrayal. But that doesn't mean it's gone. Not really. You still feel it. In the Black Legion's fury. In the rituals of lost war bands no one dares document. Even in the grim determination of some of the Emperor's own sons, those who walk through war not for glory, but for survival, loyalty, and the brother at their side. You tell me that spirit isn't Chthonian. I won't believe you. Believe, and I get it. I understand why the Imperium doesn't talk about it. Cthonia doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't offer clean lines or noble myths. It's too raw, too honest. A birthplace of both loyalty and treason, where the same knife that saved you one day could take your life the next. It complicates the story of the heresy, because it shows us that maybe Horus didn't fall because he was weak, but because he came from somewhere real. Somewhere that taught him how to fight, how to lead, and how to bleed. And maybe that kind of knowledge cuts too deep to be comfortable. What haunts me most is how easily we forget the foundations of things. How a legion that shaped the stars came from a planet most people can't even find on a star map anymore. How a war that defined the death of brotherhood ended in tunnels so narrow they couldn't fit a single tank. There's no monument to the siege of Cthonia, no grand statue to the last defenders, just stories, fragments, and silence. But somehow, that silence speaks louder than the loudest war hymn, because maybe Cthonia was never meant to be remembered through parades and plaques. Maybe it chooses to live on in scraps and scars, in whispered names, blood rituals, and the way a warrior stands when he has nothing left but pride. Maybe it's still there, waiting beneath the rubble, breathing slow and quiet, like it always has. And maybe that's what makes it so powerful. We talk a lot about what's lost in the Warhammer universe. Entire civilizations wiped out, whole histories turned to dust. But the truth is, nothing's ever really gone. Not if someone remembers, not if someone cares. Cthonia might be buried, might be scorched, might be erased from the lexicon. But here we are, still talking about it, still feeling it, still asking what it meant. So no, I don't think Cthonia was destroyed. I think it evolved. Like everything in the grimdark. It burned, it bled, and it became something harder to kill. It became memory. And memory is the one thing that survives everything. Even time. And if you've made it this far, if your heart aches the way mine does for the forgotten places, the lost brothers, and the truths the Imperium tries to bury, then you're part of that memory now too. You're helping keep Cthonia alive in your thoughts, your questions, your curiosity. And that matters. So tell me, what do you think happened to Cthonia? Is it dust and echoes, or is it something else entirely? A lesson? A warning? A heartbeat? Drop your theories in the comments. I want to hear them all. And if you want more forgotten history, more shadows the Imperium tried to silence, and more emotional dives into the scars of Warhammer's past, hit that subscribe button. Light the Vox. Join the chorus. Because this galaxy is full of ruins, and together maybe we can remember what they still mean.